Okay. Hello, everyone. I am here today with Hamza Yousaf. He is a journalist for many organizations, Declassified, the New Internationalist. Welcome, Hamza. How are you doing today?
Pleasure, good to be here.
Yeah, good stuff. Good stuff. It's crazy times we're living in, isn't it?
Yeah, it's
Yeah, yeah.
volatile to say the least.
Volatile to say the least. Um, it's been more than 100 days since we've seen the election of a new Labour government. It's been more than a year since we've seen the expansion of Israel's genocide in Gaza, and we've now just seen that spill over into Lebanon. What do you make of everything we've seen since the election? Have we seen enough from the government and from the Labour Party, or are we expecting more?
There's definitely more that can be done. We're witnessing again kind of unconditional support as Israel engages in a campaign of mass slaughter. We saw that in pretty much every single day since October, and it's like it's been on loop now. It's like we're seeing the same scenes. Israel, the media regurgitating Israel's lines. Ground invasion now they're saying, or ground operations they're now saying, which is byword for invasion, but it's not displayed in that way. You're seeing residential buildings being flattened. You're seeing children being killed, innocent civilians. 1 million people already been displaced in Lebanon. So we're witnessing another bloodbath, another carnage which has been carried out by Israel. And again, the government's not really doing anything. They're just standing by. Now, with Israel, obviously, they expressed their unconditional support and enabled them with the arms diplomatic cover. But now, even David Lammy, Foreign Secretary, made out a statement or had a mini statement yesterday, and it was again timid. Didn't say anything, nothing of note. And you can see again, like, what does it take? We've seen a year of unrelenting mass slaughter of Palestinians in Gaza. Ironically, they called it a ground invasion at the beginning, a ground operation, a very limited and strategic operation back in October. We're 11 months into that. So at the very least, when the media reports it, when kind of politicians discuss or kind of deliberate of what to do, they should at the very least recognize, look, there is precedent here. Israel needs to be reined in, but there's none of that.
And it's quite strange because if we look at public polling, there seems to be a disconnect between what the people in power and what the people in the media are saying and echoing, and what the people on the ground, both in the British Muslim community and the wider British community, want in these situations. Polling shows that most people want an end in arms sales. Polling shows that most people want, that the British government does not provide diplomatic cover for Israel. So why is there this disconnect between what we could call the establishment and what is actually desired and asked for by the British people?
Because effectively democracy is a facade, right? Supposedly all the polls show there's a new one by YouGov which shows that Israel's, in terms of unfavorability in the UK general public, a lot of people have a overwhelming negative perception of Israel. Now that should be represented. That should be, our elected representatives should reflect that in policy, in speeches, in holding Israeli officials to account. But we had two Israeli officials. We had the supposedly leader of the left-wing Labour Party in Israel, Yair Golan. He was at the Labour Party conference. So too was Zipi Hotovely, the Israeli ambassador to the UK. How are these people? Both of them have made genocidal statements. Both of them have expressed firm support for the systematic ethnic cleansing of Palestinians in Gaza. Yair Golan himself advocated for the collective punishment of Palestinians when he said, there's no problem in starving them. That's legitimate. Those are his words. And again, that is something that the public won't agree with. The public doesn't agree with kind of supporting and arming these Israel at this minute, and yet it's not being reflected in the political class or anyone. So that speaks of, well, what's the point if you're supposed to be elected? And we saw with the campaign of Palestine was firmly on the ballot in the election. But across the board, the two main parties, the only parties that can win, both of them are firmly and unconditionally in favour of supporting Israel, but the public isn't. And that's where you have a disparity. The public want a ceasefire. The public overwhelmingly want a complete suspension of arms sales. That's not been reflected by our political class.
It's interesting you mentioned that Palestine was back on the ballot in the election, and there seemed to be a consensus amongst the Muslim community, and I think generally amongst like the left-wing section of the population, including left-wing former Labour voters, that as long as an MP candidate was against a ceasefire or was completely silent on the issue of the genocide, we would not vote for them and we would actively vote against them. And that was the case. But now I think there is a bit of division about politicians who may have had a strong stance themselves for example, people like Zara Sultana, or in Edmonton, Kate Osamor, about the issue. But they are within a party which is essentially corrupted at the top or influenced at the top by kind of external factors, or a party that's not reflecting the views of both its MPs and the people voting for it. So my question to you is, should Muslims and should people who are supportive of human rights in Palestine abandon the Labour Party completely? Or is there a game to change the parties from the inside? Or is it a bit of both?
I think we're witnessing in real time the effects or the attempts of changing the party from within.
Mm-hmm.
And you're looking at, for example, the Socialist Campaign Group. Are they changing anything from within? They were suspended, most of them, for the vote on the child benefit cap, I believe.
Yeah, the two-child policy cap, yeah.
What's happened since? We have other groups within that are, supposed to represent our communities. But Labour Party policy is not changing. If anything, it's becoming entrenched in terms of support of Israel, support of, a kind of a nationalist, an aggressively nationalistic stance and viewpoint in terms of policy. So I think in terms of delivering a lesson, which did happen at the last election, I think that's probably better off, because you saw certain seats which are supposed to be home bankers for the Labour Party have been turned into wavering majorities. We had senior ministers like Jonathan Ashworth. You might have seen him on TV.
Yeah, Salty John.
He sometimes he tours the TV studios, just sometimes. He's been deposed. So that sent a resounding message. Wes Streeting, the now the health secretary, who's tipped to be a Labour leader, by some, came 500 seats short. Leanne Mohammed's campaign almost toppled him. So that sends a better message, rather than, for example, if West Streeting majority was increased, or the likes of Keir Starmer, whose majority was slashed. That sends a firm message. In other words, we are in a position to impact things and to make real-term changes. Because, like I said, from within, nothing has changed. There's, Labour Party conference just passed. There is nothing. This isn't a party committed to wholesale change. It's not a party committed to, rooted in human rights, universalism, equality, in terms of eradicating or at least attempting to lessen poverty, inequality. There's none of that. So what is the point of, who are you trying to fight from within? In terms of Labour Party machinery, that's all dominated by people who are on the same page. So when you then come up, when you present a different challenge, like the Greens did, like the Independents did, that's, I think, what sends more of a resounding message, rather than just attempts at, we're going to send letters and we're going to speak to our MPs, and our MPs are going to speak to, stand up in the Commons, or it might be PMQs, whatever it is. That's not, I don't think that's as conclusive or as impactful.
Do you see, you mentioned the challenge that came from the Independents and the Greens. Like in France, we saw how this might pan out if this is taken further as a movement, like an alternative push on the quote unquote left. Do you see something like what happened in France, where there was a coalition between leftist parties which acted as like a counterbalance to the far right party or the far right coalition? Do we see the same thing happening in the UK? Potentially that these communities who feel disenfranchised from Labour, like Muslim communities, left-wing communities, even working class communities, band together and basically say, no, we're going to take our position, we're going to vote on our principles, and we're going to counterbalance the scales. Is that something that you see could actually happen at the next election?
I think so. And I think a lot of people are under the impression that, the election that just passed, that was the moment. I think that was a starting point. And I think the next election, Labour will be significantly weaker, because they're mired in corruption. You can see they have no ideas, and that never lasts long. They're not committing to anything. It's just timid, mealy-mouthed statements. I think the next election, again, the Tories will be trying to come from the right. And I think irrespective of whatever the climate is in terms of politics, geopolitics, there's another chance to deliver a message and to show that, look, you need our vote. And that's, I think, if you gather momentum. I mean, the last election was called, everyone was expected to be around October, November, potentially January. It was called out, it was, in July, earlier than expected, June, July. And again, people organised well, diligently. It was a crash course in good organising and good grassroots movements. And their impacts, and that sent a message. I mean, you saw, as we mentioned, some of the votes and some of the ways that we delivered a message to the political class, and I think that can happen. And you see France historically, whether it's protest, whether it's direct movement, whether it's direct action, they extract a price relatively from the political class, and I think that's where we need to learn. And for example, the arms suspension, very timid. Of course, I think less than 10% of arms sales suspended, arms licenses. But that was because there was a high court battle between campaigners and legal groups. So again, the government being forced or being pushed into a position because of the pressure that's coming from within. Whereas if we just stuck to saying, okay, let's try and not take them to court, let's try and negotiate, let's try and go for conversations and whatnot. They're clear they're not on that. And they've outlined their stance, they've outlined their positions and their policy trajectory. So there's definitely, I think, something shifting in the UK. It's just whether we're as committed to it, because Palestine was a flashpoint, if you like, but it didn't. Things have been happening in Palestine for years now. It was converted into a kind of a staple for this election, but there is scope to turn, whether it's inequality, whether it's poverty, anything, fundamental cases, things that are impacting people's lives daily. That's an opportunity to make that the heart of another election, because the blueprint has been laid in the one we just passed.
Yeah, and I think there is you've highlighted something very important there, which is that this is just the start, and people's energies might drop and apathy might be a problem, both apathy about the issues we're campaigning on and apathy towards the fact that we can make change. So I think, like, my impression is people have seen people from the Muslim community go into the Labour Party over the last couple of decades through like Labour Muslim Network, or running as councillors or even as MPs. And then what ends up happening is that either A, they end up compromising on the values that they promised their constituents and the values that they ran in on, or B, they stand up for those values, and when it happens, they'll get suspended, they'll lose the whip, and they essentially get ostracized from the mainstream of the party. And that even happens to Jeremy Corbyn. He's the pinnacle of someone who's gone down that route. My thinking is it possible that, for example, when someone like Zara gets suspended and you have Labour MPs rebelling from within the ranks, does that somehow shift the ballpark on where the party should be? And now that we're seeing that the centre-right angle of the party is unpopular across the spectrum, is it a case that we are able to change within and change from without at the same time? Or is it a case that we need to have a unified narrative around one thing and pursue that?
I think we can change from externally and then prompt change internally. Like you mentioned, the kind of the deep-seated support for the Labour Party from the Muslim community. 85% turned out. 2017, similar number in 2019. And then it was a fraction. I mean, even across the board, I think it was only 59% of people, the general public, voted for the two major parties.
Yeah.
So there is a disconnect there, and it's capitalising on that. And I think by showing that we can organise externally, by showing that we can actually place other issues at the heart of non-negotiables, red lines, as Gaza was, as Palestine was, then I think that can send a message to the Labour Party. Arguably, that hasn't been felt yet, and granted, it's a marathon, not a sprint. But the reason why Palestine was such an important issue in the election was because campaigners, organisers, everybody was like, look, this is a non-negotiable. We have to make this the centrepiece of this election, and then the logic goes, then the Labour Party shifts as a result of that. And like I said, there are marginal aspects of that. They restored funding to UNRWA. The arrest warrants, that's potentially one as well. They reversed Rishi Sunak's decision, which was to obstruct it or to prevent it. Whether those go ahead, etc., that's a whole different issue. But they recognise that there's something behind them, like a presence. There's a looming cloud, which is like the constant pressure that will come. And obviously that doesn't come from the mainstream media, but it comes from our avenues, whether it's alternative media, whether it's grassroots level, good organising. And we just need to continue that, because that's, I think, the most resourceful way of impacting them and making them change tack. Because otherwise, like I said, they just kick out, they suspend, they ban, they don't allow you to speak, etc. So it's then forcing them to change or to approach it a different way.
Yeah, like I think without that electoral pressure that's always there, that drum that's always beating, then any change that happens on the inside doesn't have any like weight behind it. It's like I can't think of a good analogy. It's like, I don't know, punching a wall. You're not going to get through. Without the electoral pressure, there's no meaningful movement. And the UK system is, I think, different to the American system, whereby there are two factors. One is that votes probably have more weight, and I think money plays a smaller role. So it means that the advantage that the Muslim community and kind of the left-wing population that are generally supportive around Palestine have is that our votes count for quite a lot. They actually are quite meaningful in the political system if we're able to keep applying that pressure. Whereas in the US, they're going to struggle a little bit more, although it's a very noble campaign and they will still have an impact. But money plays a bigger role, with the packs, and they have different structural things. But what I'm thinking is, okay, we made an impact 2024, at least on the electoral picture. How do we keep the impact going? How do we keep the momentum, especially as Gaza starts to fade from the headlines a little bit and it doesn't get as much of the attention that it will deserve, especially as hopefully a ceasefire is reached and the killing stops? How do we keep the momentum going? What's the message to the community in that sense?
I think the fundamental message is that, we've started and now we have to carry on. It's not a case of, mission accomplished, because like I said, it is just the start. We showed that we can organize, we showed that we can provide an alternative, we showed that we can mobilize. And I think we have to continue in that vein, because like I said, there will be other issues come the next election. Palestine will still be, because Israel is still colonizing Palestinians and has done for a century now. But there will be other issues in terms of reaching out to the kind of the British public, and in terms of making it a potent issue. Palestine will remain that, as will Lebanon, as with other geopolitical aspects and regional aspects, but so too domestic policy. If we can show the Labour Party that, you're not going to be able to continue this conservative legacy, whether it's austerity, whether it's an economic prescription that doesn't help the disadvantaged. If we can show them that, we can again mobilize and make sure that we want a more just society, we want a better society, and we want you to enact that. And again, the threat of withholding the vote, as we witnessed, I think that can be powerful. And again, it's about making people, energizing them. A lot of people, when I was in Islington North, for example, I campaigned there. I've done some leafleting for Lian Mohammed in Ilford North. And a lot of people are like, is it worth it? Are they going to win? Like, is it really worth me turning out? But it was worth turning out, because she came within 500 votes, and Jeremy Corbyn overturned a huge majority and won it by 7,000 votes. So, with people power, you can bypass conventional avenues and bypass the party machinery and the funds and resources that they have. But again, it's about the willpower. People need to understand, believe, and kind of buy into it. And then, once you show them, I think the recent election I think it showed that, it's laid a good blueprint, a good foundation. And then now we have to, carry on in the same vein.
And you know what? As you said, with Leanne's campaign, with Islington North, it's actually all possible. Like, the math is really clear. The math is really clear about the kind of change and impact that the Muslim electorate can have in making sure that our views are as equally represented as everyone else in Britain. We can potentially be the deciding vote in over 100 seats in the country. We're talking a 10% or more. We can be a critical vote in over 30 seats in the country. And when we consider the fact that we're actually aligned with the British public on most of these core issues on foreign policy, on ending these austerity policies, and on the treatment of kind of divisiveness, of Islamophobia, of divisions between communities, the only barrier to us actually like impacting the way that the country is run and the policies that are in place and the government we see is our belief and is our energy and mobilization to go forward. Yet there seems to just be this kind of endemic apathy. And that needs to be something which is overcome. I feel like there's a culture of people sitting around and saying, oh man, things are so crap. Things are just broken. Of sitting around and complaining and looking at the political structure and the corruption and saying like, there's nothing we can do about it. It's all messed up. But you're someone who's chosen to become a journalist as your career. And you've chosen to spend your time contributing to public discourse and shifting public discourse. Could you tell me, like, in your experience, how much impact is it possible to have by choosing to be a journalist? And is it a career that's worth having? And if more people chose to be journalists, would we see a different world?
100%, because it's very much scripted. Everything that's happening, you see, it's choreographed. The media, they approach. Everyone has this idea that there's right and left media. And they may well disagree on certain things, whether it's migration, whether it's, on the economy, whether it's NHS. They may differ slightly from the Guardian to the Financial Times to the Times. On Palestine, on Israel, on the Middle East, it's just there is no spectrum. It's one side only, and we've witnessed that in the last year or so. But journalism is still one of the least diverse fields. It's still very much middle class, privately educated people, and in terms of minority communities, there's not very much. But you can make an impact. You can break through. You can shift that public discourse, because, like I said, especially now in the age of social media. If you look at kind of videos that go online, they get like 1 million views. That's more than maybe what Sky, BBC, etc. would get across the board into the weekly views. So I definitely think there's a way there is an appetite there. And like I said, there are caveats with it in terms of it's not, as you start off, it's not as financially rewarding, which I understand. That's the big part of it when people are looking for aspirations and careers and whatnot. But we need to have our voices heard. We need to expose things that the media are not showing you. So I'll give you an example. My colleague at Declassified uncovered kind of the use of the air bases in Cyprus and kind of British involvement using that in terms of helping with Israel's assault on Gaza. And that wasn't in the news at all. And then it was, and then people started protesting in Cyprus, and it became an issue, and people were aware of it, and then it's now being reported elsewhere. So if you shed light on things that people aren't aware of, then people are like, oh, hold on a minute, why is my media not reporting that? Why am I not seeing this in so-called left-wing outlets like The Guardian, like The Independent, and others, and so other BBC, Sky News, conventional avenues? And there are many aspects. Like I said, when people ask, how hard is it in this current climate in terms of, especially on Gaza, it's quite easy because there's so much things that are not reported. If you look at how LBC frames things, Sky, BBC in the broadcast, and then you look at print in terms of Times, Independent, The Guardian, Financial Times, Daily Mirror, it's choreographed, it's stage managed. It's a very specific level of framing. It's diluting the reality and giving you a version of events, not allowing you to connect the dots. And so when you provide that alternative, you kind of, the hope is that you open up people's eyes and people start to think, hold on a minute, I'm being taken on a ride here. Like this isn't right. There is more to it than meets the eye. And again, I go back to it, social media, Twitter, Instagram. That is what's helping, because people are looking in real time at buildings being demolished, the systematic annihilation of Gaza and now Lebanon, and thinking, why is the media not framing this? Why is the media still got IDF officials speaking? Why are they not challenging this? Why do media kind of broadcasters and hosts insist on, when somebody says genocide, they push back, they say, oh, but the IDF will reject this, or they say, well, Israel will reject the claims and Israel will insist it's being proportionate and has a respect for human rights, etc., human life. So I think there's huge work to do within the media, because like I said, it's when you start, a few things that I did, for example, we did a piece on British citizens in the IDF. I thought to myself, well, why is nobody else covering this? In terms of the resources, it was all information accessible online. So looking at what British Israeli soldiers had done interviews with international media, some media here as well, what they've said, basically admitting that they'd reduced buildings to rubble, that they'd attacked entire neighborhoods, that they've, bombed entire neighborhoods and destroyed residential communities, civilian communities, etc. Those are war crimes, right? And just piecing it all together, through Facebook pages. In other words, with a fraction of resources, imagine what newspapers with huge resources, with vast teams, could do with that type of information, and putting to the public domain that these are people that might be teaching your children, might be your next door neighbors, walking the streets around you, and they're committing war crimes in Gaza. So again, using information that's accessible to try and deliver a message, try and show people the reality. But again, it goes back to, why is mainstream media not reporting on this? Because as I said, they are only interested in giving you a very specific version of reality, and they take you to a place, they very carefully guide you to a place where Israel has a right to defend itself. Israel's a democracy, the only democracy in the Middle East. Israel is very proportionate in its response. Israel's been uncharacteristically ruthless because of October the 7th. I mean, when they destroy a building and they flatten a hospital and they target medical workers, why do they still include Israel's version of events? Why do they not say, well, actually, Israel has formed? They've destroyed media buildings before in 2014. They've killed medical workers. They continue to kill journalists, not just here, but in the West Bank, Gaza and the West Bank. But they don't give that, because if you're then given all the details, you begin to understand it as, hold on a minute, Israel isn't waging a campaign of self-defense. They are systematically destroying Gaza. They are committing ethnic cleansing with the Palestinians. And so the media doesn't want you to reach that conclusion, because they're effectively insulating Israel and protecting and sustaining the status quo.
So it's interesting, and we kind of saw this with the whole scandal that happened recently with the Jewish Chronicle, whereby, and I'm sure you covered this, I remember you mentioned some things about this, whereby I think one of the editors had essentially published, I think, about 9 articles with just completely false information. And then eventually we had a bunch of their key figures resigning. And then it completely undermined what has been quite an influential paper throughout the course of the last year. But my question to you is this: a paper like the Jewish Chronicle, which no one really knows who owns it or who funds it, it's understandable why they would have certain positioning. My question is, why do you feel like mainstream media outlets are positioned or are not reporting accurately or in a fair way? What's the actual reason that that's happening?
I think because they have almost a duty or their responsibility. They understand kind of from the top down that Israel's to be protected. Israel's to be shielded in terms of its crimes. And when you see across, like I said, there is no spectrum.
Mm-hmm.
All of them, from the Jewish Chronicle to the Times, to the Financial Times, to the Guardian, to the Independent, BBC, Sky, LBC, they've all reported using the same kind of script, the same type of playbook, regurgitating Israel's claims, taking them at face value, not questioning them, not challenging them. And when a Palestinian comes on, if you remember the first few months, you couldn't get a word in unless you condemned October the 7th. You were asked immediately, do you condemn October the 7th? Now they barely have any Palestinian guests on their airwaves anyway. And so when the Jewish Chronicle is an example of how a culture where you are basically allowed to say what you want on Israel, and it eventually reached its peak because they're basically saying, fabricating statements, fabricating claims, and saying what they want and lying effectively. But had it not been revealed, or had somebody not done some digging, it would have been fine. But because it didn't seem so far-fetched, in other words, what he was saying is what you'd read elsewhere anyway. So the claims he was saying, and kind of the cause and the details he was providing, and kind of the narrative that he was going with, that wasn't too far off what you'd read in the Times, or too far off what you might read in the Telegraph or the Daily Mail, or what you might hear IDF officials or Israeli representatives saying on TV, and being allowed to say that.
Mm-hmm.
So there wasn't anything suspicious about it to the naked eye. Mm-hmm. And I think that's endemic of a wider problem. In other words, Israel's allowed, or Israeli supporters or officials are allowed to say what they want. They're allowed to claim, as they did in October, that there are tunnels in Al Ahli Hospital, in Al Shifa Hospital. Mm-hmm. And then months later, their investigations come out, mainstream outlets, whether it's Washington Post, New York Times, The Guardian, and they find, oh, actually there are no tunnels. But you could have taken the words of Palestinians at the time. Mm-hmm. But again, it's this narrative or this approach where Israel's allowed to say what it wants in the media, and it's insulated from any kind of robust criticism, which isn't afforded elsewhere. If you take a look at the headlines in the last 24 hours, as Israel wages an invasion of Lebanon, compare that to how the words used in the phrases when it was Russia invading Ukraine. It was clear Russia invaded Ukraine, whereas when it's Israel and Lebanon, it's a ground operation. It's a targeted and strategic approach. When it's an invasion, there's no two ways about it. Your troops enter the area of a sovereign nation. It's an invasion by dictionary definition.
Owen Jones wrote a great book called The Establishment, and he basically, I don't know if you read it, but it's definitely something I'd recommend, where he basically talks about the fact that the world that we're told about politics, about media, about the country that we live in, about foreign policy, about economics, it doesn't come out of nowhere. It's not like everyone is just writing honest articles and honest reporting. What we have is that the world of Westminster and the world of public discourse is, I'd say, overrepresented and dominated by a certain class of people and a certain network of people who tend to share the same views. And what has happened over time is that, for example, in the 70s, we saw Margaret Thatcher and the rise of certain far-right think tanks who were able to influence politics and media and discourse through the connections they had and through the structures they built and through the narratives they got out. And my feeling is that people feel that these systems are completely rigged, and it's not just Muslim community, it's not just the left, it's actually all factions of British society feel like the mainstream media does not give them the full picture. Rather, it just gives them somebody's picture. And through the kind of more independent or alternative journalism that you've often engaged in and others are engaging in, we're now discovering truths that were not told to us before, and things that were covered up and not told to us before. And the power of that is that it kind of shapes public opinion. My question is, many people feel like situations are so hopeless. Situations like Israel and Palestine, situations like what we're seeing in Lebanon, situations like whoever is in power just seems committed to bankrupting the poor through their economic policies. They feel like even though you can change public opinion with journalism, that doesn't necessarily translate to a change in policy. So can you talk about perhaps how journalism can actually translate into changing the world that we see in the decisions that are made?
I think the more that people are exposed to, the more that they digest things that are alternative to the narratives or to the facts, or the version of the facts that are presented by the mainstream media, the more their eyes are opened, I think. And sometimes it takes a moment. I mean, I would argue that people should have been clued up and switched on about Palestine years ago. Mm-hmm. But it takes kind of what we've witnessed since October the 7th, the last year has been horrific. And that was, to people who were like, oh, hold on a minute, something's not right. Why is it you go on Instagram and you open up and you see a reel, or you see a post, or, someone's story. You see a residential building flattened, you hear the screams, you hear children, being made orphans. We have the highest number of children amputees in Gaza. And then they read the news and they think something's not adding up. we're being told this is self-defense. We're being told they're targeting Hamas commanders and Hamas militants and controlling command centers and the Hamas infrastructure. But there's entire buildings are being destroyed, neighborhoods are being flattened, hospitals are being targeted, mosques, schools. So I think because the media's been so brazen with it, people are slowly starting to see from different angles. They're reading in Middle East Eye, in Declassified, Mint Press News, for example, Double Down News, and they're thinking, well, hold on a minute, there's a clear disconnect here. We're being shown in real time what's really happening, and the media's still insisting on calling it self-defense, still insisting on calling it a conflict, or calling Israel-Hamas war, for example. It's not. It's a war on the Palestinians, and it always has been. And so I think the worse, the more that Israel engages in kind of the systematic annihilation of Gaza, and the more that the media continues to insulate it and protect it from any kind of scrutiny or criticism or showing people the reality, the more that people start to seek out alternative avenues. And I think that's where journalism can be, alternative media and kind of new media can play a part, because, like I said, you can reach people through Twitter now, through Facebook, Instagram, different platforms, YouTube, and you can give the other side, what's not being heard in the media, and then people will begin to connect the dots themselves, and then they'll be like, okay, yeah, something's not right here, and then it's multi-pronged, because then they start to turn off from mainstream avenues as well. They start to lose their views, their readership, and they start to seek out other avenues, whether that could be funding alternative media and donating, etc. So there's definitely, it can be impactful. It's a long road, because, like I said, it's still very much dominated by the same people from the same class, from the same background, and kind of the revolving door between politics and media as well. That's a problem in terms of editors moving from Westminster to Fleet Street and vice versa. But like I said, there is scope to change that. And like I said, we need more people from our communities in journalism, because we still understand our concerns and our causes a lot better, irrespective. And that's where we can empower voices and hopefully showcase to the other people who are consuming news that, look, there is a different version of events rather than what you're being told and what's being presented to you.
So I think that there's a really special, as you mentioned, social media has played a big part in democratizing journalism and allowing more narratives from a wider range of people to get to the public. However, it's also the technology involved in social media has also potentially created echo chambers. And I wonder, what's the way forward that, for example, there are parts of British society that are being pitted and divided against each other very clearly. For example, people who are labelled as far right, a lot of working communities in Britain, and then immigrants, asylum seekers, Muslims are being pitted against each other through divisive headlines. And is it possible that we can use the shift in alternative media to create bridges between communities? Does the landscape even offer that to actually create communication and harmony between communities? Or are we facing a point in our society which is becoming more and more divided, and it's going to be a harder line to cross, and that we're at a point of division between groups?
I think there's definitely a lot more division. And again, like I said, because the current Labour Party is operating from the same playbook as the Conservatives. So you saw even before the election, before the riots took place in the summer, when Keir Starmer was talking about sending people from Bangladesh back to their country, and making a point constantly about this kind of stopping the boats and migration and whatnot. We had the MP for Rotherham a few weeks before they were targeting that hotel that was housing asylum seekers in Rotherham, was talking about, stood up in the Commons and said, my constituents are expressing concerns, they want their hotel back. In other words, this kind of demonising language which pits groups against others. That's not going to change, because the Labour Party, as you can see, is intent on following that same path. We've seen at the Conservative Party conference of late, the language isn't changing, incendiary language, kind of putting targets.
It's getting worse, actually. It's getting way, way worse. Yeah.
So putting targets on the backs of migrants, of minority communities, and the people that are the front runners, Kemi Badenoch and Robert Jenrick, are in a competition to see who can say the most vulgar things at the minute. So in terms of the political class, that's not changing, but it's how we make the change from and like I said, bridging that gap. And I think, like I said, the scope of the problem was made abundantly clear in the summer. I mean, those race riots, or the Farage riots, as people put them. Mosques were targeted, Muslim graves were desecrated.
I mean, beyond that, someone was
stabbed. Yeah.
Someone was stabbed. A lady was assaulted in the street while carrying her baby. Southport Mosque was literally petrol bombed.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So it's we're not going to pretend that there isn't a big issue here. But
Hmm.
the flip side of that was the response and how the communities came together, and communities, not just those that were targeted. There were very good responses in Newcastle, in Liverpool, across the board, Rotherham, where communities got together, Muslim and non-Muslim, and were like, look, we take a stand against fascism. I was there at the protest in Walthamstow, and that was a huge turnout.
Hmm.
And you look around, it was people from all races, all colors, all beliefs. And that was, I think that's the message. I think there's such a disconnect now between establishment across, media and political establishment and the people, because they're not being, the reality of their situation not being represented by the media, and equally politicians not doing anything about it. So they're trying to now find alternative avenues. And like I said, that could be through trade unions, it could be through organising, protests, different kind of direct action. But there is an appetite for that because, like I said, people don't feel represented. The political class is not, I keep going back to this democracy and this facade that, your elected representatives, etc. It's very managed as well. We saw that the Labour majority doesn't represent the vote that they got. They got just over 33% of the vote. In other words, most of the country, they keep saying the country elected them. It's the opposite.
It's a lie. It's a sandcastle majority.
Exactly.
He got barely more votes than Corbyn did in 2017.
Exactly, yeah.
In 2019, which was literally like Corbyn's loss in 2019 was labelled as an embarrassing defeat. He got almost the same number of votes as Starmer. He was labelled as a landslide victory. And it's just because of the quirks of the system, and he stumbled onto like the biggest crumble of the Tory party we've ever seen. It was the public appetite. But you know what? Everyone knows this. You walk to someone on the street and you ask them, like, oh, how do you feel about this Labour government? They either don't care or they're not feeling favouratively about them. About the riots and about the division that's been sown against immigrants. And this is the crazy thing, is that kind of the political class have been using immigration and asylum seekers as a pawn for a long time. We saw immigration and like quote unquote legal migration rose under the Tories for most of their leadership, while at the same time they would use their platforms to scapegoat migrants. And now it's likely we will see the same thing under Labour again, that migrants and asylum seekers are blamed for the country's economic problems, and yet they're used as a short-term economic crutch because, spoiler alert, you can bring in migrants, they will work for a lower salaries because competitively from where they've come from, it's a good pay, and then they're used as a crutch to support the country. My question is, do you think that the animosity that's felt towards migrants from parts of the community that manifested in the form of riots, do you think that is genuine hatred for them being different people, where they've come from? Do you think that's whipped up hatred from the media and the political class? Or do you think that it's a bit of both, or maybe it's one becoming the other?
I think it's a mixture. I think you look at the rhetoric that's been for years fermenting in especially in our media. You look at the kind of the language used, invasion of what is often used. You look at kind of when they had those there was a whole issue of where they were kept in, conditions they were kept in, and ministers were saying that's not a problem. These almost like painting as a threat to society. You see often in like local newspapers and local media complaints about where they're being housed and whatnot. And these are human beings at the end of the day. They're fleeing war, and they're fleeing wars and sites of conflict that Britain has directly contributed to, and that's the key issue. And if you want to take a look at, if you want to apply race and kind of ethnicity and all the rest of it and colour to it, you look at how Ukrainian refugees were treated. People were queuing up to take them in, and there was a very diligent attempt from kind of Britain across the board, across the establishment, to ensure that people are taking refugees and doing their best to help. And then when it's someone from Syria, from Iraq, from Palestine, from Yemen, from elsewhere, all around the world, it's a different approach completely. And what is that if that's not racism, if that's not a hierarchy of importance in terms of human life? And I think that's what we're seeing a lot. And as I said, the Labour Party is not trying to change that. It's contributing to it. And what will happen, the Labour Party won't push back against the rhetoric coming from the Conservatives as they go further to the right. And then they'll lose the next election. And the Conservative Party will be even more right-wing and try to pander to the base, because it looks like it could be generic or bad, and it could be someone else. But their rhetoric is dangerous. And they'll shift the conversation, but Labour won't push back against it. They'll go with it for the fear of, we might go down in the polls if we don't, even though they're polling very badly now anyway. So there's no positive in sight, it kind of in the long run. But it's like you said, it's a combination of people You know, when there's economic despair, and we've just come off back of austerity, we've had economic problems for a while now. You see the gulf in terms of inequality. The rich are getting richer, the poor are getting poorer. Nothing's changing. Labour Party is not offering prescription for that. There is no, the Conservatives obviously won't. And so people need someone to blame, right? And often the easiest part and the easiest tried and tested, unfortunately, is to blame and scapegoat migrants. It's just, unfortunately, the easiest thing, and all of Europe does it. It's always happened throughout history. And that doesn't look like it's changing anytime soon. And like I said, that's why when people talk about the change in the Labour Party, we have a Conservative Party in all but name. You know, they're just the colour of the tie has changed. That's it. The policy remains exactly the same. For all that's been said now, you could tell me if you covered or told me to look away at somebody who was speaking and said, forget what's been, just focus on what's been said. What Keir Starmer was saying could be what David Cameron said in 2015. David Lammy the same. So it's not. They're not representing change. They're not representing the people. And as I said, people need to be represented. People are struggling. We had, especially post-COVID, we've had people struggling to heat their homes. The phrase often comes up, choosing between heating and eating. That's still the case. That's still a problem. And you're looking at kind of people, housing crisis. We've got poverty, we've got inequality, homelessness. There are so many issues. NHS, you can't get an appointment these days. And people often say, oh, that's because of the NHS is dysfunctional. Why is it dysfunctional? Because of a decade, if not longer, of austerity, of gutting it. Public services, look at how schools are. And again, people just don't connect the dots because the media doesn't represent those. I mean, when the Labour Party tried to had the cutting the tax for the private schools, so that they basically paying more, so applying more of a tax on private schools, and the private schools would in turn raise their prices. I mean, it was in the media like it was a storm. It was like, oh well, what does that mean? In other words, they recognise that the schools, in comparison to private schools, that the other schools, standard schools, which you and I would have attended and you and I go to and our children will go to and most of society go to, they were like, oh, but our children are going to have to go to those schools. But what's wrong with them? That was an admission that they're dysfunctional, they're not working. And that's because, Conservative policy and now Labour policy was working as intended in terms of not bridging that gap, not bridging the wealth disparity and economic inequality. So like I said, it's the two always go together. People get poorer and then people also need someone to blame. And it was interesting when those people were kind of looting and rioting and like I said, torching mosques and desecrating graves and specifically targeting migrants, Muslim communities and minority communities, they were seen to have legitimate concerns. Like those were thugs. They were people that were looking to go on pogroms, right? And yet, when the Muslims tried to vote because they'd been left behind and kind of their views dismissed, they were seen as sectarian. They were seen as voting on ethnic lines, and it was dangerous, etc.
So what an incredible double standard that was. People are committing crimes in the streets, torching public services, and literally attacking and assaulting innocent civilians in the streets of Britain. They're labelled as people with reasonable concerns that should be heeded to. Whereas when one particular community goes to the ballot box around an issue, which is, by the way, being debated as a genocide in international courts, and to anyone who has actually visibly been watching, it's very clear what's happening. Those people are labelled as sectarian, as divisive, as attempting a takeover of the country, and all kinds of things. And I think if that doesn't highlight to you just like how absurdly broken the media apparatus is across the spectrum, then I don't know what will. And it just highlights the need for individuals like yourself to come up and provide alternative narratives through these powerful alternative outlets that are coming up, and potentially by making your presence felt within mainstream organizations too, because people don't realize you can go into The Guardian and write an amazing piece, or you could go into The Independent and write an amazing piece. Iman Irfan wrote some amazing pieces. But until we place importance in journalism, until we invest in journalism, until we fund journalistic organizations and journalists, we are going to be subject to the impact of the alternative. And I think people don't realize that things are poised to get worse before they get better, right? Like outlets like outlets like GB News and the Daily Mail, they're not funded through grassroots fundraiser campaigns. They have very wealthy backers who promote certain interests. You mentioned the NHS. There's a reason that kind of the far right or reform leading spokespeople have started to talk about privatization of the NHS. It's because the bodies who help fund their campaigns and their outlets also have interest in private healthcare. And you see this reflected in all of their policy points, that the same corruption and cronyism that we're seeing from the center right, we're seeing on the far right as well. It's just a weird place that we're in, but I think it's important that we that we engage, and I don't think our community yet understands how we engage or how to engage. We need to make that connect between the methods of change and the change that we want to see. I lost my train of thought again.
Take your time. All good.
So, in your journey as a journalist, are there any like particular challenges or roadblocks that you faced, or things that people might not know about when you're pursuing this kind of path?
Yeah, like I said, it's not very diverse field, and sometimes as you're breaking through, I was very lucky with kind of the editors I worked with at the beginning. They placed a lot of trust in me, and I always told myself, I know I back myself. Once I'm given an opportunity, I can kind of, if you leave the door ajar, I'll kick it down. Basically, like I'll force myself into the field. But it's interesting because sometimes, like, some of the people that maybe not editors you work directly with, but people that you might have sent emails to, or, you know, people that you might have inquired about certain articles about pre-October 7th, and you'd be like, oh, you know, this is happening in Palestine. It could be a home demolition. It could be this. It could be that. And they'd just be like, oh, not this time. Now, it's kind of the pendulum switched, and everyone's trying to commission everyone's trying to get things out there. But then we're just basically using the same script as the mainstream media, right? Where only a flashpoint is important. And you see, like, some stories which I covered. I did a piece for Declassified on, there's a cross-party parliamentary group, which is meant to be for the prevention of genocide. So I got like a tip from someone, did some digging on it. Turns out the chair is Labour Friends of Israel. Turns out some of the members attend receptions hosted by companies linked to Israel's arms trade, or arms Israel's been using in Gaza. Other ministers within it, or other members within it, are open supporters of like anti-BDS bills, or openly support Israel, etc. And I remember saying to myself, like, why is this not covered by anyone else? Or like, why, if this is information that's accessible, I didn't do anything incredible. I just looked at what's online and connected certain dots. And even when you do like certain interviews, I remember, I won't name the broadcaster, but they basically said to me, look, we want to have you on. Would you be okay using X, Y, and Z in terms of certain terms? And I thought, what kind of terms that I'd use anyway if I'm discussing on what kind of what's happening in Gaza. But the specific framing was that we can't have our own presenter. So this is a conversation I had with producer. And they say we can't have our own presenter use these words.
Yeah, like I'm pretty sure the BBC, or either the BBC or Sky News, had a blanket internal ban on using the word genocide.
Yeah.
Right.
So they would much rather prefer it comes from a guest, because that can be dismissed as, well, that's his opinion. Whereas if a presenter's bringing in and using the words genocide, ethnic cleansing, slaughter, etc., then it's different. And so just these small framings, even, again, I've had interviews cancelled, I won't name broadcasters, but where they, you know, somebody will be asking, oh, can you come on, etc. They're looking for someone who's British Palestinian or someone who's Palestinian. And then somebody will recommend me, and then they'll just be like, oh, sorry, interview cancelled. So, and I've spoken to people who do interviews that are recorded, so not live. And then when they look back at it, when they send the clip that they're going to upload, it's been completely censored, completely edited out, etc. So there is so many people just think that, oh, well, you're given a platform, you know, you go and speak, etc. It's not like that. Like, it's, you know, it's very, like, I use the word choreographed. It's very stage managed. It's designed to make it look like they're platforming, there's plurality, and there's voices that are being allowed to express whatever they want. It's not like that. And the problem is, I think, as well, within our communities, I know people who are being silenced within their own newspapers, or their own, where they're pitching things daily to newspapers which are supposed to be, you know, moderate or left leaning, and they're saying, well, they're coming up against the wall every single time. And you're looking at thinking, well, if these people aren't going to be on your side, because we know the Times won't publish this, for example, or, you know, the Daily Mail or the Telegraph, but if others are also not going down that path, then again, it's very sensitive, it's very, very strict management. And we saw kind of a textbook case in terms of the media and high profile presenters with LBC and Sky. Sangeeta Mask was taken off air, so too was Beldonati. Both their crimes were questioning Israeli officials. So people are under this impression that the media allows free speech, or the media, even when presenters are allowed to say certain things, there are consequences. And this leads to a culture of suppression and a culture of fear within newsrooms. So yeah, I'm not really selling journalism well here, but like
but it needs to change, right?
Yeah, there's a big block, like there's a big hurdle to overcome in terms of the mainstream kind of dominance of certain voices or certain mindsets, certain approaches. but you can make a difference. Like I said, there are numerous news outlets out there breaking things and make, pumping into the mainstream and countering kind of narratives that are coming from the mainstream avenues.
And do you think organizations like Double Down News, like Declassified, who are providing cutting edge stories and language which are not being used by mainstream outlets, do you think that pressure actually shifts mainstream outlets to be, I guess, more liberal in their use of certain language and terms?
I think so, because there's some presenters now openly on LBC who've used words like slaughter, ethnic cleansing, mass killing. They're questioning whether Israel's strategies are about getting hostages back.
Mm-hmm.
And you're thinking LBC's, it's an echo chamber of all the wrong type of views, right? So things are changing in terms of even the language that's being used. Of course, you still get the likes of BBC and whatnot push back when someone says genocide, but it's like the genie's out the box. It's the indefensible is, people can't defend the indefensible anymore. So I think there's definitely been a shift. I see tweets from presenters journalists on Twitter, and they're mentioning like the Israel lobby. And I'm thinking, this wasn't. If you said that 4 years ago, you'd get all sorts of accusations. You'd be cancelled. You'd be.
Yeah, I think people underestimate two things. One, which is how influential a presenter or a mainstream news figure could be, or the editor of a newspaper. They're not just background figures. These are maybe 40, 50 people who collectively shape the way the country thinks. And people also underestimate how powerful like one piece of journalism, one piece of knowledge could be in changing the way that those people operate and the way that those people run their papers. Many of them people will never budge on their position. Many of those people, no matter what they hear, would never be able to, give up that undying allegiance to a certain state or a certain policy. However, maybe there are people within newsrooms that are amenable. And the actual journalism that happens, the true journalism which uncovers stories, might shift the entire landscape of media. Maybe that's idealistic, but maybe that's how things actually happen. But when you compound that with the fact that like there are young journalists going into agencies and saying, I want to write this story, and we've got great columnists out there who are doing that, this kind of wave of pressure, just as we see with parties, might be shifting the world of media, the world of language, and ultimately the way the country thinks.
Yeah, I think there's definitely, like I said, in politics, in media, there's ways to infiltrate and ways to kind of kick the door in, basically. Because like I said, we've got 5 great independent MPs now in Parliament. We've got the independent candidates who have made safe seats into, waver thin majorities, marginal seats. Now you've got journalists who are constantly trying to push certain stories. You've got journalists who are breaking certain stories and making other mainstream avenues or mainstream outlets also report on those same stories. So there is a level of pressure that's building, and it's multi-pronged. And you've got level of the grassroots organisation, you've got legal campaigners, human rights campaigners, you've got court cases. There's so many different aspects of it. Journalism is one side of it, but as long as we push together, as long as we all go on the same path, I think it's definitely doable. But there are industries which do need more representation, more of our voices. Journalism is one of them. Politics is another. Now you could argue, why do you want to go into politics? And I hear that case
all the time.
Yeah,
all the
but
time.
These are the people that shape lives. These are the people that shape narratives. These are the people that are impacting what's happening in real time and what affects us. So it's important that we have a seat at those tables, and then we can begin to hopefully change the direction.
And I think it's also important to remember, like, if you don't engage, others will engage for you. If you don't tell your story, others will tell your story. And if you don't make your point, others will make their points over you. And other communities and other movements have had success by persisting and by pushing and getting the narrative out. The civil rights movement has had success in that way. Other movements have had success in that way. There's no reason that a movement which is in defense of human rights for Palestine, a movement which fosters the voice of the Muslim community, can't have that same impact if we are persistent and if we are strategic in the way that we do it. So I think that lack of belief and that the shift in mindset that we need from seeing this as something which is like optional or nice to something which is absolutely necessary. My feeling is that shift needs to happen.
Yeah, I think it's happening, but it's baby steps. We're at the kind of right at the beginning of it.
Yeah.
But like I said, the more people involved, collective power is collective willpower, and not just the actual power.
Do you feel like it's a thing in the younger generation, and that there might be a bit of a disconnect between older Muslim communities who maybe don't see the value in this kind of thing, and then younger people who are immersed in that world of discourse and digital media?
Yeah, and there's maybe the older generation who are kind of stuck in old habits, whether it's voting Labour Party, still turning on the BBC News. Because for a lot of people, if they want to catch up with what's happening in the news, they turn on BBC News at 10, they turn on Channel 4 News, etc. and they're perhaps not on Instagram, for example, they're not on Twitter. So there is definitely the avenues that we're using. We need to make sure that those avenues are available for everybody. But like I said, in terms of political participation, that was a strong point in the last election. In terms of the consumption of media, patterns are changing, habits are changing, and hopefully, like I said, we're making long-term changes because it is for the betterment of all of us. It's just like I said, it needs to be. We need to create the energy. We need to create the buzz for it. And at the moment, it seems people are a bit downbeat, thinking, "Oh, we can't change anything," but you can. It takes a while, but it needs willpower. It needs kind of organizing collective action, and it's definitely doable.
Yeah, and the Muslim vote, I guess we have a weird problem in the sense that much of the electorate, especially because voters have to be over 18 to vote, is that much of the population, and Muslims as Muslims as a group are quite young proportionally compared to other groups. There are more young Muslims than old Muslims compared to other groups. So we have this problem whereby a lot of the people who are engaged in politics or engaged in these issues tend to either not be able to vote or tend to be less interested in politics. And then there are large populations of people in our communities who are able to vote and have traditionally always voted Labour, who we kind of can't reach through these new means. So these are kind of challenges that we need to figure out how to deal with. Because really, the Muslim voting turnout is only 40% on average. And that's 20% lower than the national average, which means there's a gap in participation. When it comes to the community and getting everyone engaged, what are your thoughts on, I guess, the actual steps the community needs to take to make sure that we're all engaged, from the uncle down the street to the young guy at uni?
I think it's awareness, raising awareness.
Yeah.
For example, boycotts. We're all doing the boycotts. We're all, making sure, conscious decisions not to purchase certain products. But for a lot of people, it's just as easy as putting something in your trolley, as you always have done with you're in the supermarket, or not going to that supermarket, or making a decision, cancel your bank, change your bank, what you're purchasing, what you're not purchasing. So there are patterns of behavior that, we need to make it across the board, targeted boycotts, and just generally, even if, you're seeing a lot of the older people, for example, at protests, younger people. So whereas there's things that are more, older people are more prone to do, so that could be voting. Historically, obviously, they vote more than the younger population. How to make the young population do more of that, and then equally, stuff like social media consumption of news, boycotts, the apps, for example, scanning items whilst, as you're shopping live. How can young people bring the older generation into that? And just bridging those gaps in terms of what, and, habits that other different generation are more likely to do, making sure that's something across the board. But like I said, it all comes from awareness raising, going to events, seeing, even I was at an event not too long ago. This was in the elections, kind of local groups and who wanted to turn out and vote and whatnot. But it wasn't that much people attending, right? Even when you're campaigning and stuff, you knock on people's doors, the younger generation, like, this is no point. There's no point voting. So once you change those perceptions, it's all about changing perceptions, raising awareness, and also giving a feel that you can win. Because once people have a sense that they contribute to something profound, and they feel like I'm part of a movement here, rather than I'm just going to vote and my vote's not going to go anywhere. When you feel like you're part of a movement that's building, and that you're going to also benefit, your children are going to benefit, the guy down the street is going to benefit, then I think it's like I said, awareness raising and building those channels and building those movements, make it sustainable, basically.
Yeah, wicked. I think that's probably all we have time for today. Okay, cool. That's all we have time for today. Thank you for listening. If you want to find Hamza, you can find him on Twitter. Anywhere else?
Twitter, Hamza _A96. Instagram is the same, and follow my work. You can search my name declassified elsewhere, Hamza Yousaf, and it should come up.
Cool. And that's Hamza Yousaf. Take care.